All right, how you doing, Mark? Good.
Doing good, man. Yeah, crazy morning, but everything's good now.
Cool, cool. How long were you an amateur before you became a pro fighter?
Um, the very first, I think I had two fights, and they were really small. Boss Rutan was my coach. It was just pancrase rules, and did that. And then I snuck out and I did a fight on my own. He told me not to, and that was for no money. Actually, I paid money to actually fight with the hopes of making some. So yeah, I just had the two, and then I started doing some pro fights that I just was not ready for. I shouldn't have been taking.
So I know it was a brief period in your life. How long were you competing as a pro fighter?
I think from 98 to 2004, and that included professional boxing as well, and which was an even worse mistake because I had no amateur boxing experience whatsoever. I had maybe 10 rounds of actual sparring before I got thrown into my first professional fight. After I realized I wasn't going to be any good at boxing either, I went back into the cage stuff, had a couple more fights, and then I finally stopped. So probably from 98 to 2004 was when I was active. When I went and did the book and started training with guys again, I almost took another fight. But fortunately, I realized that would have been a very bad mistake.
How hard was it for you to transition from being a fighter, competing at a pro level at one point, to becoming a author?
That I was actually trying to do both at the same time. So the whole time I was fighting, I was also writing. I used to like writing short stories. I think it probably when I was taking on a lot of abuse and I was, taking a lot of blows to the head and stuff, there were periods where I couldn't write. It just wasn't possible. I remember there was one time where I had double vision for over 2 weeks and headache every day. And like that made writing impossible, but it really didn't interfere too much. And one nice thing about all the fight experience and all the jiu-jitsu and everything else is how much better it makes my fight scenes in my books, in my fiction. It definitely adds to that. So I think it's a little bit more realistic than the average person who, a lot of writers have never thrown down or know what it's like to even be hit in the face. And I think it often shows in their writing. So if nothing else, it's given me that.
Did any of your experiences while fighting drive you to write about certain topics?
The whole reason I did Unlock in the Cage, where I went around the country and interviewed fighters, was to understand why I had fought. Because I could never understand, people would ask me all the time, they're like, well, why did you fight? And especially I wasn't making money at it. I wasn't very good at it. So, why was I doing it? So that's why I started going around the country, interviewing all these guys. I interviewed, I think 340 fighters, maybe 60 or so coaches. I figured if I could figure out why they fought, then maybe I would see why I fought. I really enjoy writing fiction. That's my go-to. That's what I'm passionate about. One of the short stories I wrote is called Mutual Understanding. And that's about if people were allowed to handle their problems with violence. If you could just get into, and it actually takes place at a park, people agree to fight and then they could fight to the death if they want, or until someone gives up. So I'd say the fighting, it probably sparked a lot of short story ideas.
Did you run into any obstacles on your road to becoming a published author?
Yeah. And so much of that was self-doubt. I think a lot of people, a lot of authors, they're not sure whether or not they're any good. And I remember when I started out, so in 2012, that's when I wanted to call myself an author. That's when I released my debut book. I had already published a lot of short stories, but that was my first thing where I was trying to say I was an author. And that was a really hard thing to do. And that's exactly the time that I started going around the country and interviewing all these fighters. And again, I had so much self-doubt. I didn't think I was good enough to be called an author. I didn't want to be called, I couldn't even call myself a fighter because I was like, well, I was a terrible fighter. So who am I to go around and to do, all these interviews and all that. So more than anything, it was all the self-doubt, the low self-esteem stuff. That was probably one of the biggest factors. And then one of the things that's really slowed me down with being, hitting the success, let's say, that I want to reach, the number of readers I want to reach, has been I've always focused on the creativity and not the marketing, not the business side of things. And so that's what I'm finally doing now. Now that I have so many books out, now I can sit back, fix everything up, work on the marketing side of things. And, and now I'm starting to see it take off. And so that's that's good. But, I was so fixated on only creating. I had this idea in my head, well, I don't know how to sell stuff. I don't want to market. I don't want to do those things. But as an independent author, I'm in charge of all of that. And so I had to take a serious look at like, okay, what am I doing wrong? Who do I need to hire? And just making sure that I had the right people to help me get to where I want to get to.
So I know you wrote a book, your MMA book, Unlocking the Cage. What other topics do you like to write about, and what gives you inspiration to write about them?
Um, well, right now, so after Unlocking the Cage, as much as I enjoyed that process and I've made so many great friends, found martial arts again, got myself and my entire family into jiu-jitsu, I told myself I would never write nonfiction again. It's like, because it's not what I enjoy doing. But because of Unlocking the Cage and because of, while I was doing Unlocking the Cage, I was also sparring. I got to the point where I went from being a complete scrub to where I couldn't even get through the beginning of a class to getting to where I was able to make it through a whole class and then starting to spar with guys, started to spar with better guys. Got to the point where I actually got thrown in against Fabricio Verdum for 5 minutes and then Babalu, and they beat the shit out of me. It was terrible, man. And my buddy was there taking pictures and he's like, and afterwards he told me, he's like, hey man, he's like, you got to start looking into brain damage because he's like, you're a 40, I think at the time I was 44, 43, but going in there with guys that are half my age, that are athletes, that are skilled. And, my problem is I was always kind of a tough guy and I could take a lot of damage, but I never looked at the brain stuff. And so I started looking into brain damage. I promised my family I wouldn't spar anymore. I wouldn't fight. And now I'm working on a book on recovering from traumatic brain injury, because as much as I wanted to say I didn't have any brain injuries, man, all the testing showed absolutely opposite. And the scary thing too is I had a lot of friends from Brown University where I played football that were contacting me when they saw that I was researching brain stuff. They admitted, through messages like, hey man, my brain's fucked. My brain is wrecked from football. And these guys didn't even go on to play, they didn't go on to do MMA or boxing or anything else. They just got all this brain damage from football. And so I realized how important it is. And so that's why I went ahead and, I'm working on that. But at the same time, I'm working on my fiction. My fiction is my passion. I have a series of books called Try Not to Die. They're like the old choose your own adventures where every couple of pages you have to choose what happens. But in this one, if you choose incorrectly, you die. And so there's only one correct way through the book, but there's about 30 ways that you could kill the main character. So that's a lot of fun. We just released Try Not to Die in the Pandemic. That's the third book in the series. The next one is Try Not to Die Super High. We have one set for Try Not to Die in Iraq. And with each of those books, it's really fun because I get together with friends, and so they co-author the book with me. And, a lot of stories I wouldn't be able to write on my own, I'm able to get with people that have experienced these things and then write a much better book. So I have that series. I also write suspense and sci-fi as well. So I'm pretty much all over the place, man. I like having multiple projects that I could just jump in and out of. Some people may say that's not the best approach, and I've wondered whether or not that's good. But for my brain, it works. And the nice thing is, sometimes, and with that approach, sometimes it could feel like, man, when am I ever going to be done with this? When am I going to finish this project? But like this past year, I released 4 books. So in 2020, I've released 4 books plus a short little 4-story sampler. And that's because, I'm just constantly working on something. So each individual project may take a while, but because I have so many in the works, like it will eventually get there.
Keep it busy for 2020.
Yeah, for sure, man. I was like, it was either going to be, frustration of being, home with the kids and more work and more laundry and more dishes and everything else, or, and frustration, or I could just focus and get stuff done, and so that's kind of been the focus, like, okay, take care of the family, but also continue to write, make sure to do that. And that was one of the nice things with like Trying Not to Die in the Pandemic. I was able to put, fears and frustrations and everything else, put that into my writing. I've realized writing is just such a powerful tool. I didn't never looked at it like that before. I never wanted to even be a writer. I was like, that's a nerdy thing. You know, I don't want to be a nerd. And that was just in my head. But now after doing it so long, I realize how much it's helped me. One thing I often do with friends is I give them an assignment where they write about something in their past that changed them, like a moment in their life that turned them into a different person. And that's an incredibly powerful tool. My friend who was in Iraq and had night terrors, I did that with him. We were working on Trying Not to Die in Iraq. That's the only thing that changed between him having his night terrors and finally getting rid of them. And he had them for like 7 years. So it was a process of talking about these experiences and then writing about them. So I realized how powerful it is. And that's something I'm going to be doing in 2021. Already starting to set it up. I'm doing one course for the military, one course for first responders, and where they're going to, I'll help them develop a short story, writing about a moment that really changed them, because trauma, so many people will experience trauma and then we want to pretend it never happened. We'll box it up. We're like, oh, I'm not going to touch that again. Why would I want to relive that? Why would I want to think about that? It's in my past. I was like, well, that's not really true. It is in your past, but it's still right there, and it's causing this problem and that problem and that problem and some other stuff you don't even realize. But if you really want to take a look at it and you write about it in first person and do these different techniques, I think it's a really powerful way. It's painful and it's not fun, but it's a really powerful way to kind of heal yourself. And so that's something I'm going to be doing with a lot of different people, and I'm excited to see what kind of response we have. I know it's going to help people, so I'm excited about doing that. Something I could pass on.
That's awesome. Now, I love MMA from amateur to pro. There's incredible feeling you get from watching and cheering and heckling, for your favorite fighters. Uh, but I know there's plenty of things that could probably be fixed in MMA. I'm a big believer that MMA fighters should earn more on every level, from amateur to pro. So, being a former pro and amateur fighter, what can you tell us about the fighter pay?
Yeah, I would say the fighter pay is awful. It's been great to see that it's gone up, but I do think it's just they're being taken advantage of. It's kind of always been like that. I think it's always going to be like that because there's never going to be a shortage of people that will step up and be like, oh, well, I don't need to be part of the union. I'll fight for $50. I'll fight for $5,000 or whatever else. So there's going to be always those kinds of people. So as long as there's that, I think promoters will take advantage of it. They'll want to make that money. I don't know how the pandemic is going to affect all of that, but yeah, one of my friends, Leslie Smith, female fighter, UFC, awesome person. She's really fought a lot for trying to improve fighter situation and make money and get everyone in a union. I don't know what the answer is, but yeah, I think it's always been like that with boxing, especially on the lower levels too. I got to experience lots of that, and then the low levels of fighting that I did. I mean, I was paying more to go to fights pretty much than I was making them. I think the most I ever got paid for a fight was probably like a super brawl, maybe like $1,200. But that meant going to Texas, taking off 4 days of work, without pay, pitching in for gas or whatever else. And, so there was never I was never fighting for money. I think back then that's what a lot of guys did. They just weren't really fighting for the cash. But now I think more and more guys are taking it seriously, taking it for as a profession, as they should. I mean, they are taking so much damage. I have a hard time watching it now because of that too, and especially because I have so many friends. Before, it would be hard for me to watch because I know how much these guys want it, especially after hearing so many of their stories. I would usually go and watch the guys that I interviewed, but I was like, man, I've heard these guys, some of them even crying, telling me how important it is to them, how much they've given up in their life, what they've sacrificed, how this means so much to them. And then to go and watch them lose, to get kicked out of the UFC or whatever else. I was like, that was hard. But then when I started seeing all the brain damage and I realized what's going on with that, I was like, so as excited as I get about watching fights, like I still love watching fights, but there is part of me it's like, oh man, it's like I don't want to see someone get wrecked. But on that same hand, one of the nice things is I've realized with my therapies, one of them has been going to neurofeedback. And so I've done neurofeedback, behavioral therapy, chiropractic. I've done all these things to improve my brain. And my doctor was telling me, he's like, okay, we're at the point now where you can still play these sports and have a healthy brain. It's just they have to get better at recognizing concussions, making sure guys are taking off time, making sure guys aren't going crazy, sparring all the time. That was one of the things like with AKA, I really enjoyed my time up there, and I didn't see too much of the crazy sparring, but they were known for, just beating the hell out of each other. So I think, yeah, there's different things that need to be fixed. Pay for sure is one. And then the other one is just being very, very careful with these fighters, making sure that they don't come back too early, because most fighters don't care about their brains. We all think that we're immortal and it doesn't matter, and whatever else. So a fighter is never going to be like, oh yeah, coach, I need to take some time off because I got a headache. So I think that's something that coaches need to really watch out for. And managers, you need to take care of your fighters and really be considering not only their arms, their legs, all those kinds of injuries, but what's going on with their brain, and to make sure not to put them into a fight too early if they're still healing, if they still have the concussion. Because that's where I did a lot of my damage, where I would, I had a terrible concussion. I remember one time I had a car accident. I wrecked my car at 70 miles per hour. 2 days later, I was sparring and I got hit with this really hard shot. And so I lost 15 minutes of time where I remember seeing the hit coming in the first round, and we stopped. And then next thing I know, we're out of the ring, and I tell my coach, I apologize to him because I couldn't do a good job. He's like, why are you apologizing? I was like, well, I didn't even finish the first round. He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, you did 4 rounds. He's like, after that hit, we took, you got your water. He's like, but you just finished 4 rounds with him. He's like, that's the best you ever looked. But I had no idea what day it was, how I got there, or anything else. And it was because, sparring so quickly after a major concussion from the car accident. So that's where the real damage can come. So just, I think guys need to be aware that if they had a really tough, sparring session or whatever else, just to give their brain a little break, and take it easy. And I think most professionals, especially at the higher levels now, are realizing they don't need to spar that hard anymore. You don't need to kill each other in the gym. I think that's something that the lower level guys maybe aren't figuring out yet, but most of the high level guys know. It's like, it's not about getting killed for no money in the gym. Like, just work on technique.
Awesome. Now, you mentioned about different stories for the fighters. What was one of the I guess one of the most like
moving, or
like one of the most moving stories and one of the most maybe sad stories or something like that?
Well, one of the very first ones. So when I first started the project, I told myself I didn't know whether or not it was going to be any good. I'd never interviewed anyone in my life. Another reason why I told myself I shouldn't even do it. But I was like, I'll give myself 3 weeks. And so I started back east in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And I went to Triforce MMA. And Andre Sukum man, I just messed up his name, but look him up. He is a UFC fighter. I believe he's still in the UFC. Amazing guy. But he started telling me the story about losing his son. His son had died, and I forget how old his son was. Very, very young, and it was just such an emotional, emotional interview. And his future wife, they're married now, she was there and pregnant with their next son. But being able to hear that story and why he was fighting because of that, how MMA saved him, gave him this release. He had so much anger and aggression at losing his son. And so there were a lot of, it wasn't always about loss, but there were guys that were in there that had a lot of trauma from losing friends to suicide, and a lot of guys just hearing their story about growing up and how to them it was normal. That's just how it was. One thing that surprised me when I was interviewing Dominic Cruz, So we were talking and going back to his, growing up. And he was like, oh yeah, I was 5 when, my dad told me I was going to be the man of the house and he was leaving. He's like, your normal talk. I'm like, dude, that's not normal. I was like, maybe that's normal for you. I said, but the average, like that never happened to me, and maybe a lot of kids have experienced it. I was like, but I wouldn't consider that normal. I would consider that something that, really shaped him and changed him. And so it was really cool to be able to see, what were the things that drove these people, the guys that were successful. It's like, okay, what made them successful? What was their drive? And it's like, okay, oh, these guys found wrestling and that gave them this determination, and these guys did this, and then I would see guys that were like me, that were in there for all the wrong reasons, that wanted just to be tough guys, that had lower self-esteem, that were, maybe one of my big things was, man, I didn't care about myself. I was suicidal. I just wanted violence, whether it was done to me or to do it to someone else. And those kinds of people aren't going to be successful. And so I can see that. I was able to get a lot of great advice on being a father, because at the time, I think my daughter was only 2 or 3, but I was talking with all these guys and I could tell which ones had good relationships with their wives, which ones were good fathers. And so I would ask them like, hey, what makes a good dad? And Matt Grice, who was in the UFC before he had a really bad car accident, like he was talking about how much he worked. He not only did he have the gym, but he's also a police officer and he was fighting in the UFC. But he was talking about the importance of, when he's with his kids, he's with his kids. He's not on his phone. He's not looking at something else. He doesn't have the TV on. Like, he's present. He's with his kids. And so by hearing all those things and hearing guys talk about all the things that they wish they had done different, was really big too. Another great interview was Marcus Davis over in Maine. He was talking about his troubled past and how much he got into trouble, as a young kid, and just how his life is now. And so it was kind of a blueprint for me to be like, okay, these guys are successful. These guys are happy. I want to start doing these kinds of things. I don't want to end up like that guy or that guy. And so I got to stay away from those kinds of things. So yeah, it was definitely a learning experience. It wasn't all just about MMA. I realized I just like talking to people to find out who they are and how they got that way. I think it's super interesting. I think if more people did that with, friends, strangers, whatever, I don't know. Every time I do it, I always get something positive from it.
Now, which of your writing projects was the most accepted by your fans, and why do you think that is?
The fan favorite of mine right now is Twisted Reunion, and that is short stories, but they're all horror. So it's pretty dark, pretty disturbing, really violent. Like my mom can't read any of my stuff, but for whatever reason, people really enjoy it. It's a lot of people say it's very similar to Stephen King. He was one of my. He's probably the author that I've read more than anyone else, and so he's probably had the biggest influence on my writing. Him and Dean Koontz, and so that's probably my number one book. I have another one called Untold Mayhem, which is more horror and crime, suspense type stories. Those seem to do really well. I think people like being able just to have a little bit of, it's nice being able to just read a short story, take 10, 15 minutes, read a short story, you could put it down. And that's kind of how I am, because, man, it's hard finding time to read. You can't read everything that you want to. So that's one of my favorites, or fan favorites. And then my book Brightside, which was my debut novel about telepaths that the government rounds up and sticks in a little mountain town. That one has like the most reviews. It's done really well. Everyone says that needs to be put into a movie. And I just made that one free. So that one, anyone could get that one on any retailer, whether it's Apple, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. So if you look up Brightside, that's for free. You could check it out. And I think I have another Somber Stroll, which is like 5 horror stories. That's also for free. And that way people can get exposed to it. And if they like it, then they'll pick up the sequel.
What writing project are you currently working on?
So that one is the one I'm spending the most time on right now is Try Not to Die Super High. And that is being co-authored with a good friend that I made through fighting, through Unlocking the Cage. Steve Montgomery, he fought in the UFC, a lot of other promotions. But just an awesome guy. He was one of the last interviews that I did when I went down to Florida, American Top Team, and we just really hit it off. I liked his approach. I like his take on life, and so I offered him to co-author a book. He came up with this entire storyline himself. So, but right now I'm working on it. And man, it's brutal. It's disgusting. It's going to be, it's a lot of fun, but because of like in the book, a lot of these people are having it's airborne rabies, so almost turning into zombies. So there's a lot of face biting, and I just did a scene, cleaned up a scene where it's a car accident, and even just that, like, because when I'm writing a scene, I need to really picture it. I need to see what's happening, and I'm very visual, so I'm thinking about blonde hair and brain matter on the back of the seat, and and what this person's body looks like, and so that's the one I spend a lot of time on. I go back and forth into my traumatic brain injury book. When I have something new to write about, I'll jump into there. And then, but those are probably the two that I'm spending the most time on right now.
What advice would you give an aspiring MMA fighter if they are set on pursuing their dream to go pro?
I would say surround yourself with great coaches, uh, great partners. Don't. That's probably the biggest one, man. Is not having a manager or a coach who's going to take advantage of you. Someone that's going to look out for you, and just to understand. Have realistic expectations, understand the toll it's going to take on your body, on your brain, on your family. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing whatsoever. Like I wouldn't talk someone out of it. I'd just be like, hey, be aware of this, this, and this. But I think really having a strong gym behind you, not a place that's going to just chew you up and use you as sparring material or whatever else, but a place that wants to develop you and take your time, so I think that's probably the most important thing, not to rush it, because there's no point. I've seen so many guys that have kind of rushed into fighting only to realize, okay, now I have a losing record, now I can't get any fights. Now I'm just an opponent now, and just what that can do to someone's mindset. So making sure that you're brought up the right way, with someone that's looking out for you. I think that's important because fighters as a breed are going to be tough guys. Like, oh yeah, I'll fight him. I don't care. I'll fight him. Even if the guy has a better record and everything else. I fought Travis View in Mexico when I think he was 24-3, and I had like 3 fights. And just doing stupid stuff like that. But it's like, oh, I don't care. Like, it's a challenge. I want to prove myself. And so don't be a tough guy. Like that doesn't make sense. Think of it as a business. So as long as guys are thinking of it as a business and not in a rush to get there, train as hard as you can and smart, but not be in a rush to try to, not taking fights that you shouldn't take. I think that's a big one.
Now, what advice would you give an aspiring writer?
Be prepared to spend a lot of time on your craft. And just like with fighting, and that's one thing that's kind of cool, is being able to compare the two. Like when you start out fighting, you're not going to be any good. You could probably barely throw a jab, or maybe you could, maybe you're strong, or maybe you have certain things. But the same thing with writing, it's just a different muscle. And so you have to use it. You have to write, you have to write, you have to read, you have to write, you have to write. I show people all the time my drafts. Like, I think a lot of people think when they write something, it's going to be really good and that's all they got to do. And I was like, no, my pages are completely full of red ink. And that's after like 7, 8 passes on them. So it could be the 8th time that I've gone over a chapter and I'm still going to be tearing it apart and looking for a better way to write it. So understanding it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort. You just need to just stay with it and stay positive. Surround yourself with other authors. I think that's something I haven't done. I've been very, I'm starting to do that now, but before I was like, oh, it's just me, it's just me. But by getting together with different authors, getting people that could give you real advice, and a lot of friends and family are just going to tell you your stuff is wonderful. They're not going to give you the honest feedback like, oh, dude, what's that? Or don't use that, or don't say that, or whatever else. So I don't know. I'd say that, and also to be very realistic with what's going to happen. I think when I released Brightside, I was like, oh, everyone's going to love it. I'm going to be a big success right away. If you're an independent author, especially, that's not going to happen. So I would say just take your time, do your research, give yourself the best opportunity for success, which is something that I didn't do that I'm having to do now, like finding out all the right keywords and categories and thinking about it as a business instead of just simply, oh, I wrote a story and people are going to love it and I'll put it out and everyone's going to read it. It's like, no, you got to do a lot of work to make sure the right people are going to see it. Who's your audience? Asking all these questions, but just understanding it's going to take time. And like, I do it because I'm passionate about it. I love it. That's why I'm doing it. And just like with fighting, like if you don't have that drive, if you don't have that love, then do something else. But if it's something that you enjoy, then just keep at it and figure out these things along the way, and eventually you'll be successful, I think.
Now, have you had to travel a lot for writing books?
For Unlocking the Cage, I traveled a lot. Unlocking the Cage, I went to 23 different states and I visited 100 gyms. I think that's one reason why I enjoyed that part of it. I feel like I got a really good look at all of MMA, going to small fights in Tennessee and, seeing all these different areas where people grew up. So I was going to poor areas. I was going to rich areas. I was able to see how it's like, okay, all these guys in this gym have this kind of thing. So by traveling like that, it was really cool. It was also very taxing, very hard. I was driving all the time. I was eating like crap, staying in motels. So it wasn't fun, but each of the interviews motivated me to go to the next one because I was getting so much from them. As far as the other books, I do everything from home. I don't really have any need to leave. Like I can disappear. Like I generally, I'll use cannabis or whatever else to help sometimes get me focused. And then I'll just disappear into that world. So whether I'm at a desk, which I'm usually not, or I'm somewhere else, it really doesn't matter. It's like all I need is I need quiet and I need pen and paper or computer, and that's it. So yeah, that's why fiction definitely is a lot nicer.
What has changed for you as far as your process goes since publishing your first book?
I've gotten way better at realizing how to write a story, how to break it down, whether it's a book or a short story. I was like, I'm breaking everything down into three parts: so the beginning, the middle, and the end. And once I realized that, that was such a big help for me because I realized I was like, okay, it doesn't have to be that hard. Even a chapter, I'm going to break it down into three parts, and then the beginning of that chapter, I'm going to break it down into three parts. And so before you know it, I have it all plotted out. It just makes it so much easier for me. I realize I embrace my editors. I realize and realizing that I'm not going to create perfection. I was a perfectionist my whole life, which really held me back because I wouldn't want anyone to see something I did unless it was perfect. Now I understand. It's like, well, it's never going to be perfect. And not only that, like the first chapter might be completely cut by my editor. I might go through all this entire book, spend so much time on this first chapter when it's just going to be thrown out. In fact, Brightside, I finished that complete book, thought it was perfect, but then I found my writing mentor. I realized I wanted to work with him. He took a look at it. He's like, oh man, he's like, this book, he's like, I'll work with you, but it's in third person and you need to change it to first person, which meant I pretty much threw the book away and completely rewrote it. So it took me another year and a half. So, but at the same time, all that time spent on the first version, I was working that muscle, I was developing it. And, if people take it like that, if they could take it where, okay, I'm going to learn, I don't know everything. I don't know much about writing. And that's my approach is like, man, I'm no expert in anything, but I'm starting to get these cool things. I'm seeing how people are reacting. Oh yeah, that's a cool technique. That's a cool technique. I'm going to borrow that, And so by doing that and by learning and just accepting, that you're not going to be perfect and not striving for perfection, I think that's a very, that's helped me out a ton.
Now you said you like reading Stephen King books. What's your favorite book by Stephen King?
Probably The Stand. The Stand was awesome. That's a huge book. I think it's like 1,200 pages or something. And it's been a while since I read that one. So many of the books I've also watched, but I loved his short story collections. That's what I think that's what got me hooked. I would always take those onto airplanes, like Night Shift and 4 different seasons. There's so many of his, I would say I like his short stories better than his novels. But it is an awesome movie and a book. Yeah, there's just so many amazing ones. Although the last 10 years, I don't think I've read any of his stuff in the last 10 years, just being busy, writing fiction, doing my own stuff. But yeah, he's definitely been a huge influence. And man, I would, anytime that a reviewer mentions his name next to mine, like that makes my day. I'm like, oh, that's cool that I could even be considered in the same league as him by these readers. So yeah, that always makes me smile.
Now, has anything changed as far as your publishing your books? What's different? Is it easier now or?
I would say it's much easier. And like I mentioned earlier, I did 4 books this year. So that's not only, creating them, but and doing the actual writing of them, but then the marketing of them, the publishing of them. And yeah, it's been a lot easier. I've gotten together with the right people. I have the good software, and it's just figuring out how to do it. I think with anything else, like you just put in the time, and now I'm on book 10. And so, every book is going to get a little bit better. One of the things I'm doing now is I'm redoing covers. I'm realizing I was like, okay, this cover isn't that great for, like, we just redid Twisted Reunion and Untold Mayhem. So those are my 2 horror collections. Both of the covers I liked a lot, but when you see them on Amazon, they're really tiny and you could barely see. They almost just look like they're black or gray. And so just redid those. I'm really excited about those. And so yeah, so I think it's constantly learning. It's constantly thinking. Thinking outside the box is big too. Like for my last 2 Try Not to Dies, I've run contests. The Try Not to Die in the pandemic, we had over 1,000 people were reading it a day at a time. I just did it all through Facebook Messenger, and that's something other authors haven't really tried that yet or embraced it. And it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty cool. And I've made some really awesome fans from it. They all enjoyed it. It gave them something to do, during the pandemic. And so that was a lot of fun. So I think it's thinking about different ways to grow and just trying to learn as much as you can. The more you learn, the better and more successful you're going to be, whatever it is, I think.
Now, where can everyone find your books?
Everything is on, if you go to marktullius.com, that's my website, but all my stuff is on Amazon. And now the majority of my books are also on Barnes and Noble, Apple. So pretty much everywhere you can get stuff. But Amazon, Mark Tullius, that's where you can get absolutely everything. That's always the easiest place to find stuff.
Now, I wanted to ask you, you said about that book that you can take different paths and maybe most of the time you can die, but there's one good way to get. How did you come up with that idea?
Man, I think the thing that got me into reading as a kid was Choose Your Own Adventures. It was a series of books where every couple pages you get to choose your path. And I love those books. I just thought those were awesome. They were fun. I liked, because I've always been into video games too, it's like, so I'd rather have a choice. And when I first started doing the Try Not to Dies, I wanted to make them like that, where, there was all these different paths, and then you could, if you went this way, then you could do this and this and this. But I realized for what I wanted to do, it wasn't gonna be a fun story. None of those paths I wouldn't be able to go enough into them to make it like a real story for adults. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna have the one path and then all these ways to die. And readers have been really enjoying it, because they tell me the books are made for young adults, but it's adults that are really liking them because they grew up on the Choose Your Own Adventures as well. And so for them, it's kind of a nostalgia thing. And but a lot of readers will tell me, like, man, whenever it comes to a decision time, like my anxiety goes up. And they're kind of tense, even though it's just not a big deal. The character will die; it's not going to affect them, but because they're written in first person, and that's my goal, is the reader should feel like they're experiencing it. And so when they have to make a tough decision, like I want them to really feel like, oh man, one of the choices in pandemic, it's you and your girlfriend and you're in this room and there's terrorists that are there, and this guy is running for your door and he's screaming for help with the terrorists behind him shooting at him, and you have to decide, do you slam the door in his face and lock it, do you let him in, or do you just split? And if you make the wrong choice, and a lot of people would feel terrible about, slamming the door on them, but there's a good chance that's the correct answer, because if you let them in, you're probably going to get blasted. So I think it's fun to include stuff like that, and just to also remind people, like, man, death is death can happen in a second. We never know when it's going to come. So sometimes in the books, it's just a wrong choice. It's like, man, you went left when you should have gone right. You didn't know a car was coming right there, or whatever else. So I think for me, that's what writing is about. That's what all my fiction is, man, is trying to deal with that fear of death and try not to die. It's like, what better way than that? That's what we're all trying to do. We're all trying not to die. So yeah, I'm actually putting a lot of emphasis on it. Before I was considering, I thought of it as just kind of a fun thing for me to do. It's like, oh, this is a fun thing with friends, but now I'm realizing the importance, I could make this will probably be one of my most successful projects. I think, especially now I realize the power of series. I think, and for other authors that are listening, I think 52% or over half the people that buy books are buying them in a series. And so having a series really helps. And I have 20 or more in the works for this one. And I'm going to try to release like 3 a year. So at that kind of rate, if I'm that productive, I think it's going to do well. And, I want to get it on Netflix. We want to make it animated. And so, yeah, I have big plans, man. I want to do as much as possible, have as much fun as possible, and just no regrets.
Yeah, I've been listening to your Unlocking the Cage book. I've been listening on, I
Oh,
think it's Audible.
yeah.
And
Awesome.
as soon as I started listening to it, it engaged me. It kind of, I just wanted to listen to it as soon as I started hearing it. Like it's a story. Like it feels like it's a movie.
Oh, awesome.
Listening to it.
No, that's super cool to hear. And because I really doubted that one a lot. I was like, especially because I wasn't as into nonfiction as my first nonfiction. But that's what I was hoping. I was like, if I can get people to feel like I'm just telling them, a story, if I'm just, and I think that's something for authors to realize too, like just embrace the way that you talk, the way that you think, instead of me trying to sound like Stephen King or trying to sound like a nonfiction writer. It's like, no, this is how my brain works. So this is how I'm going to tell the story. Just like if you were my friend sitting across from me, I'm going to tell it the same way. So no, I appreciate that feedback. That's super cool to hear.
But I was interested in the bright side cover.
Oh, you like that? Oh, very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, so I was like, oh, that's going to be the one of the ones that I read first, right there.
Very cool. Yeah, that one's a lot of fun. And part 2 in that one I just finished, and I think it's a super exciting one. Sometimes I'll release a book and I won't feel that confident with it or that great about it, but the Bright Side and Beyond Bright Side, man, I enjoy those ones. That's almost like one where I'll do a money back guarantee, because I was like, I think people will dig it. So
definitely. Great talking to you, Mark. Definitely, if you ever need somebody, I was actually in the military, so if you ever need somebody for that, let me know.
Hey, if you want to be one of, because in that group that I'm doing the writing exercise with, I have there's going to be 6 people that I'll be working with, that I'll be talking to. Then the other 94 people or whatever in the Zoom session will just be watching and doing it on their own. But if you want to be one of those people, that'd be awesome, because another guy that I just met with on the Scuttlebutt podcast, he was also military, and he's going to do it. And he's got a couple other friends that are going to do it. So I think it's going to be powerful. And yeah, and if you want to do it, I'll send you all the info, and yeah, I'll make sure that you have one of the good seats.
Yeah, definitely. Represent the Marine Corps in there.
Yeah, no, very cool, man. I love it. I was very close to going into the Marines, and then I was 2 weeks away from going into OCS. And then that's right when I got into fighting. I also got into trouble, and that's what got me out of OCS. But I appreciate, and I could only imagine how much going into the military would change someone, whether it's, even boot camp, just that alone, how much that would change an individual.
And before you go, I definitely want to ask, I know anyone that wants to, I know a buddy of mine just published a book too. So I know he's going to want to know maybe, but he does he does nonfiction.
Okay.
Even though, like, what's your process like?
My process?
Mm-hmm, like, I don't know if you could reveal the secrets, but
No, I think, and that's one thing I'll be doing in my class. We'll just be focused on a short story, but even if we were going with something bigger, it would kind of be the same, where I get my ideas. I figure out what I want to write about, and then I just break it down. I'm like, okay, let's just break it down, and breaking it down into the 3 parts. Like, okay, what's the overall story I want to tell? It's like, okay, I'm going to talk about this guy, and I know he's going to go here, and maybe I don't know what's going to happen in the middle. Sometimes I'll know the end of a story, sometimes I'll know the beginning, and I just write what I know, and then I like putting it on a big piece of paper and then just starting to fill it out. And again, not worried about, and this is what I tell my friends, don't get hold up like not knowing it yet. Is not a big deal. If I don't know the start, I can still write down as much as I want. And so I'll write down and then I'll go through. I'm like, okay, chapter 1, I'll write a paragraph, I'll write a paragraph on chapter 2. I don't know, chapter 3 yet. So I'll put, I don't know what this is, but by giving yourself the permission to not know stuff, I think that is super helpful. Yeah. And then just plotting it out. But that's what I'll be doing with everyone in the class too. It's like, okay, this is how we do it, man. It's just, and it's a lot easier when you have someone like me asking you these questions. I think that makes it much easier. But if you get to the point where like, okay, I'm just got to ask myself these questions, like, okay, well, what's next? But the biggest thing is just going. And some people, won't like it that way. Some people think they got to start on page 1 and write page 1 and they need the perfect sentence. But I was like, nope, you just get it out, throw it up, man. Just like get all of it on the page. You could delete stuff later. You're going to move stuff. But by starting to put all these words down, all these ideas down, they could be completely wrong, but it doesn't matter. It's like you got something on the page. You're going to feel way better about it. You're going to sleep about it, sleep on it. And then the next day you'd be like, oh yeah, that was wrong. It's not a girl, it's actually a man. And just changing it. So I think, I think the biggest problem is not censoring yourself so much that you just are paralyzed and you're not actually writing anything. Just write it. Know that you're going to get an editor that's going to clean it all up and that you're eventually going to figure out the story. But if you just do a little bit every time, then on the next pass, I'm going to write a little bit more. On the next pass, I'll write a little bit more. And then, by the 4th or 5th pass, then it's almost there, and then I could fine tune like, okay, now I got to go into chapter 3. Now I got to go here. So that's my approach is like, I just slowly build things up. And and for me it's proving to work. I'm happy with the rate of getting books out, and and that's just from this kind of approach.
Awesome. And where could everybody reach your social and everything?
Everything is on youcanfollow.me, Mark Tullius. And the nice thing with my name is if you type in Mark Tullius, you'll find me, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It's Tullius. Luckily, there aren't a lot of us with that name, so it makes it nice and easy.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I appreciate you coming on the show and definitely had a great time talking to you.
Yeah, man, this has been so much fun. Thank you for having me on. And dude, I'm really excited about you doing the writing class too. So I will send you a message on that as well.
Thanks a lot, Mark.